Welcome back, my friends. And I think I'm prepared. I hope that you are. Got my book, waterproof mascara, fresh box of Kleenex. Let's get started. We're nearing the end of the story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski. I promise you, it's a good book. I went home this weekend and held my dogs a little bit longer and tried to look at them and even let them choose. Like I've got one little dog that is 15 years old and she cannot hear a thing. And so I've been trying to teach her a little bit of sign language, which she's picking right up. But she's also trying to teach me what she wants by her body language, which is really great. So yeah, I don't know if this book has helped you see your ownership of pets, especially your dogs, in a different way, but I'd love to hear about it. Please leave me a comment, make sure you subscribe, and let's get started. This chapter is called Glen Papineau. It hadn't exactly happened the way Claude predicted, but once the seed of the idea was planted, Glen found himself brooding over Edgar Sawtelle. Claude had worried about him filing a lawsuit, but that was the furthest thing from Glen's mind. The fact was, over the last several months, Claude had turned out to be a pretty nice guy, a fine friend. Dragging them into court wouldn't be right. They were nearly as busted up over his father's death as he was. Plus, they had a runaway to worry about. Anything bad a person could wish on them had already happened, and worse. No, the way it worked in his mind was, suppose Edgar did turn up. Suppose Glen walked into his office one morning and a description of the boy had come over the wires. Would he call the Sawtelle straight off, or would he want to check it out first? That seemed like the humane thing, verify it before he got their hopes up. It depended on where Edgar turned up, of course. A lot of runways stuck surprisingly close to home, which for Edgar meant Ashland, Superior, Eau Claire, or one of the dozens of small towns in between. An easy run to fetch him. Glen could even imagine going as far as Madison, though much beyond that, and Edgar might as well be in California. Yet, suppose it was nearby. Suppose the officer would call him, who was a small town cop like Glen, and Glen would just walk in and say, "Yep, that's him." That'd be the right way to do it. Identify the kid in person before making calls. Avoid any confusion and a bad false alarm for Trudy. He'd make small talk. They'd sign custody over, and after that, it'd be just Glen and Edgar in the squad car. Of course, he'd deliver Edgar safe and sound, but that didn't mean he couldn't stop to ask a couple of questions. Discuss what had happened in that mow. Find out one way or another. It was natural for Glen to imagine that conversation taking place in the squad car because he did his very best thinking there, right behind the wheel with the trees and fields and houses sliding across the windshield. He liked to let his mind wander a bit. One thing that really bugged him was the notion that other officers, and he used that word with a grain of salt because it implied a certain dignity and honor they didn't all have, mocked him. He had a nickname, he knew, something hung on him since childhood. Ox. He hated it when people called him that. After graduating from Mellon High, he thought he had left it behind, but somehow the trainees at the academy in Madison had found out. His looks didn't help. People took one glance and thought, that must be the one they call Ox, practically mouthing the words. Before long, someone saw him in his blues, and that cemented his fate. That memorable but tenuous connection to Paul Bunyan, or rather to his beast of burden, Babe, the Blue Ox. The name didn't bother him so much as the implication that he was clumsy or stupid, but most people saw what they wanted to see. Little skinny guys looked smart, big guys looked dumb. Even police officers trained to see past appearances fell into that trap. And when they saw Babe the Blue Ox coming, they saw dumb, and any little mistake became emblematic. For example, the interview with the boy at a staff meeting in Ashland, it let slip that Trudy had translated Edgar's answers rather than having the kid write them out. And people had actually guffawed, like, there goes Ox Papineau, doing the dumbest thing you could imagine. What they didn't understand was that his pop had spent the night with the Sawtelles. He stopped by the office that morning ahead of them and said in no uncertain terms, to make it quick, that Trudy and her son were wrecked, barely functioning. There wasn't any use forcing Edgar to relive the experience, and it might very well do damage, so Glen had promised he'd keep it to the point. Plus, the night before, the boiler had gone on the fritz, and he'd spent every spare minute that morning convincing it to work. When the time came for the interview, he maybe hadn't been as prepared as he would have liked. Yes, he had had Annie type it up and run it out to them to sign, but that hadn't stopped the wingnuts and Ashlyn from reenacting the scene, one of them asking questions, another waving his arms around in a reply, a third spewing preposterous interpretations. It had gotten so that any time he asked a question, they launched into mock sign while some wise guy leaned over and whispered, "He says he didn't do it," which cracked them all up. Stupid old Babe, the blue ox. So whenever he dwelt on the idea of questioning Edgar again, his spirits lifted, not in an entirely nice way. When he was patrolling with nothing much else going through his mind, he imagined glancing in his rear-view mirror and seeing Edgar sitting back there, and then Glen asking what the hell did happen up in that mow, Edgar. "This is my father we're talking about. I have a right to know." "That's all I want to hear what happened." And then, in Glen's imagination, Edgar Sawtelle did something he'd never done before. He replied out loud. He said, "I'm sorry." That was it, just "I'm sorry." In Glen's imagination, the boy's voice was as gravelly as an old man's because it had never been used. The gratifying thing was Edgar had chosen to speak those first words to Glen because he knew he had contributed to, if not caused, Pop's death. That showed true remorse. Once the little movie got into Glen's head, it stuck like a burr. He began to rehearse it in all kinds of places. Sometimes they were alone on a country road without a farmhouse or a car for miles. Sometimes he had just parked the cruiser in front of the town hall. A last chance before we go inside kind of scene. Sometimes they were caught in traffic in Ashland, but wherever it happened to be, Glen always looked up in his mirror and asked his questions, and always Edgar Sawtelle answered out loud. Glen had even begun to say his own part out loud as he drove. "What the hell happened up there, Edgar? I'm asking because I'm his son and I have a right to know." The first time it felt silly and he blushed. Despite himself, he looked to see if the mic key wasn't somehow freakishly depressed and had been transmitting. He could see the reenactments of that in the locker room in Ashland. But it was okay, totally private and cathartic. He did it again, even picked up the mic, pretended to key it, and asked his question, letting his eyes burn into the mirror. Sometimes he emphasized son, sometimes no. He finally settled on a version with emphasis on both, but just a little more on son to make it clear he was speaking as a family member and not as a police officer. All of this was very satisfying. Less satisfying was that no one answered, and that was where things stood for a couple weeks. Then, like a man shaking himself out of a dream, he understood he was being compulsive and bizarre and had to stop. It was a little too much like some other activities he could name. You shouldn't do them, even if they felt good. Nobody had to tell you that. You just knew it wasn't healthy. In order to purge himself, he decided to talk to Claude. This time Claude had come to Glen's house. They sat in the living room and talked until the wee hours. After enough beer, and enough for Glen, had come to mean a 12-pack as the summer went along. He stopped going to the Kettle or the Hollow, had even started driving to Ashland to stock up. He'd stammered out the basics of his little scenario. Confiding in Claude turned out to be the right decision. Claude said two things. First, he was beginning to think that Edgar wasn't going to come back. If he'd been gone that long, almost 2 months, he must be pretty committed to staying away, and by then he could have made it to Canada, Mexico, or either ocean. Second, and more important, he thought Glen's response was totally reasonable. And after all, did Glen want to hurt Edgar? Certainly not. He just wanted to put the question to him, didn't he? Hadn't they both lost a father in the last year? Wouldn't Edgar want to ask the same question if someone knew what had happened to his father? Damn right he would. Would you look at it that way? Even Edgar could hardly begrudge Glen a single gosh darn question when the tables were turned. In fact, the longer they talked, the more it seemed that if Edgar did show up, Claude would have no objection to Glen taking the boy for a ride before he came home, if that could be arranged. Which seemed possible, since if he was coming home, it was probably going to be escorted by a cop. Of course, he could always hitchhike back home, Glen said. Even then, Claude mused. Maybe something could be arranged. Claude could call, let Glen know Edgar had shown up. They'd installed a phone in the barn that summer. He could just wander out, pick up the handset, and some night when Trudy was out, Glen could swing over. Glen would look the other way. They agreed it wasn't ideal. It would be better if Glen asked his question before Edgar got home, because Glen thought, what if the answer were something more than I'm sorry? Then they'd have to take a ride to the tank in Ashland, go through the whole sorry juvenile justice meat grinder, which, by the way, meant that he walked away with a clean record at 18, no matter what, which some people might find a little unfair. Glen had fretted over the logistics of it. How exactly would he get the boy into his car if he were already home? He didn't think he could just talk Edgar into going for a ride. In fact, he'd probably fight like the dickens to avoid it, and fighting a kid it hadn't been part of the movie in his head. Because what those idiots up in Ashland didn't understand was that Papineau valued finesse over strength. Even in his wrestling days, lunging against 300-pound behemoths with their hands hooked behind his neck, finesse always won out over simple strength. He had tied guys into knots with finesse, and those skills hadn't gone to waste either. Just the other day, he'd used them when Matt Colgren, fighting with his wife again, decided to swing on Glen. Plus, in Glen's imagination, one of the reasons the boy was willing to talk straight, was willing to talk at all, was that just being in the car made it clear how explaining himself would get him home. Glen wouldn't say that, of course. That's what it was. Finesse. But if the boy was already home? Glen had been puzzling a lot on that one when Claude grinned a funny, nasty little grin and held out a freshly uncapped bottle of beer. Something about the gesture set Glen at ease, because if there was one thing Claude Sawtelle understood, it was the nature of camaraderie. Claude leaned back in his chair and he took a long swallow of beer and looked over at Glen. Have I ever explained to you, he said, about Prestone? When Claude called that night, all he had said was that Edgar had left a note on their kitchen table. Claude didn't know if the kid had stolen a car or what. Most likely he had hitchhiked home and was hiding in the woods somewhere. The note said he was coming back the next day, so if Glen was going to ask his question like they'd talked about, he needed to get to the stick. Then he was faced with it. All those times he'd imagined Edgar sitting in the back of the squad car during the day, in the country, in town. Now it looked like it was going to be out in the country, and at night. If he acted on it at all, with the opportunity staring him in the face, Glen wasn't sure it was such a hot idea. Claude had pretty much read his thoughts. Sounds kind of dumb now, doesn't it? Yeah, Glen admitted. Oddball thing to do, at least. Well, no one would blame you if you didn't, Claude said. You're the only one who has to live with it. Either way, it's just, I've been thinking. I don't see how it would work once he's home. If you've ever seen Trudy when she's riled up. Oh, yeah. Then you know what would happen. When we talked, it seemed like you could just come over and take him, but now I'm thinking we were unrealistic. Could be if you want a chance to talk with him, this is it. Glen admitted he was probably right about that as well. So what do you think, then? Claude asked. Glen was quiet for a long time. Did he say where he was going? No, just I ate while you were gone. I'll be back tomorrow. I'm looking at the note right now. What did you tell Trudy? What do you think I told her? Oh, well, it can't hurt to take a little drive around, I guess. Then Claude hung up and Glen stood, receiver in hand, listening to the off-hook stutter tone begin. He thought about the Prestone trick that Claude had explained, something he'd never heard of, but of course Prestone was almost pure ether, and Glen knew just where there was a supply of true medical-grade ether. That made him smile, because he liked the idea of one-upping Claude just a little bit. Somewhere along the line, Glen had acquired a beat-up old whiskey flask, a good-sized one with a pull-off top, and he pocketed that now and headed out the door. He parked the cruiser in the grass around the back of the shop, unlocked the side door, and walked past the shrouded furniture and examination tables. He opened the door to the little closet pharmacy. He didn't have to look around. In his mind's eye, he had already located what he wanted. Up on the top shelf, 3 tins sitting in a row, each topped with a squat mushroom-shaped cap. The labels were printed in cream and brown. Ether squib for anesthesia, USP, 1/4 pound, poison. Below that, in broad green script, the word copper protected were inscribed. Glen was a little surprised. Claude hadn't commented on those little cans that night. He perused the pharmacy. They were an oddity for certain, and Claude didn't miss much. But then Claude hadn't grown up a veterinarian's son. Perhaps he didn't know what he was seeing. Glen pulled a can off the shelf and gathered a few other supplies and took them outside, locking the door behind. The stuff was potent. You didn't want to mess with it indoors unless you had the ventilation equipment roaring, or you could knock yourself into outer space. He pulled the whiskey flask from his back pocket, twisted off the cap, then punctured the mushroom cap on the ether with the cruiser's ignition key and began pouring the ether into the flask. It dripped and gulped out, silvery clear as water. He set the tin down and widened the hole, but even then, without a funnel, it took a good long time before he was done. He wasn't so dumb as to think the whiskey flask wouldn't leak vapor, but he knew a little trick from his pop. He snagged a surgical rubber glove on the way out, and now he stretched it over the neck of the flask and twisted the cap down, pinching the material tight. Then he peeled away the excess until just a little skirt of rubber remained below the cap. He waved the flask under his nose. The good thing about the ether was you could smell right away if it got loose on you. But his improvised rubber glove seal worked fine. Only the faintest whiff came to him, the residue of a single drip, evaporating quickly off the warm metal, a flowery petroleum odor that tingled in the back of his sinuses. He pitched the ether tin into the woods and carried the flask two-fingered to the squad car and set it on the passenger side of the broad front seat. Glen knew those back roads pretty well. If he kept an eye out, he thought he might come across the kid walking along the road or cutting through a field. He could also cruise the roads near their place looking for suspiciously parked vehicles. If it wasn't a couple of high school kids necking, it might be Edgar sleeping in a car he'd stolen. He tried approaching from the south first, but there was no Edgar walking along, no cars parked in any of the dozen little pull-offs that hunters like to use. All the hill near the Sawtelles, Glen made a three-point turn and headed back to the highway, then came around from the north. All he saw was Jasper Dillon's truck broken down near the old Mellon Cemetery, where it had sat for the better part of 2 weeks. He stopped and shone his flashlight across the dusty bed of the truck and through the window, in case Edgar was using the truck as shelter for the night. But the only thing the cab contained was a greasy toolbox and 2 crushed packages of Marlboros. He walked back to the squad car and pulled away. Then he was coming up on the Sawtelle's yard, close enough to see the light at the top of their orchard. He parked about 50 yards back from where the woods cleared, pocketed the flask, a couple of rags, and a flashlight, and set off. Keeping to the far side of the gravel road, he walked the length of the yard. A dog was running loose, circling the barn in silence. Before it could spot him, he turned and cut down along the fence line north of the house. When he reached the back of their garden, he found a little path worn into the woods. In the open, the late moon had given plenty of light, but once in the woods, Glen had to flick the slider up on the flashlight and swing the beam to and fro across the tangle of night-black foliage to see where he was going. Within 30 yards, he knew it was pointless. If Edgar was holed up in the woods, Glen would never walk up on him with a flashlight. Maybe if he was sound asleep with the fire blazing, but why would he do that if he planned to come back the next day? Why not just walk in, save himself the trouble? And even supposing he was in those woods, the Sawtelle place was, 90 acres, 100? Glen could search for a week in broad daylight and never find him. He turned and retraced his route, and when he reached the road again, he stood looking at the house. Either he's in that barn, Glen thought, or he's miles from here, and there's no way of getting into the barn without the dogs raising Cain. It wasn't going to work. He crunched along the gravel toward the squad car. Something told him he shouldn't drive past the Sawtelle place, having already taken so much trouble to avoid it. With the headlights off, he pulled another 3-point turn and headed toward Mellon. Maybe he would patrol a few more back roads on the way home. The moon was bright. The underbrush leaned into the road, green and hypnotic as it flowed past the high beams. Red lanterned eyes looked back from the tangle just often enough to break the pattern, keep him alert. Only after his breath came easier did he realize he'd been panting. To stop, he forced himself to sigh. When he reached the blacktop, the cruiser picked up enough speed to level out the potholes, and float along through the night. Tendrils of fog drifted palely across the road, condensing on the windshield like a kind of dream writing that he let accumulate and then erased with a swipe of the wiper blades. All of that put him at ease. After a while, he couldn't help but glance into his rearview mirror. With great earnestness, almost bashfully, Glen let himself ask his question out loud one last time. This next chapter is called Edgar. He tracked the morning kennel routine by sound from his hiding place high in the mow. The August sun beat against the barn roof, and the atmosphere near the rafters squeezed beads of sweat from his skin. To pass the time, he counted the points of the roofing nails hammered through the new planking and thought how in days past he had instead counted bright pinholes through the roofing boards. Light seeped around the edges of the mow door, filling the space with a dilute, perpetual dawn. By mid-morning, his mother had worked the 2 pups, then the 6-month-olds and the yearlings, and rotated back to the pups. Edgar could close his eyes and hear her cajoling them in a low, even voice, see her crazy walk the little ones, ask for retrieves of the others, always testing, proofing, asking what it meant and didn't mean to stay. Watch, recall, follow. He drifted into a half-sleep suffused by those sounds, as if he himself had grown to envelop the mow and the barn and the yard. There was the slap of the porch door as Claude went inside, the twinning ring of the telephones both below and in the kitchen, the jays bickering among the ripening apples, a car idling along the road, gravel crunching under its tires as it passed the tree line by the garden. Near noon, there was a restrained clump of feet on the mow steps, but he didn't fully wake until the vestibule door had already swung open. He flattened himself into the hollow in the bales, sweat streaming from his face. There was a long silence. Then the door closed and there were descending footsteps. Below, the sliding gates banged shut to lock out the dogs while Claude cleaned the pens. Edgar sat up and drank from the coffee can, resisting his body's plea to pour the water over his face. After a while, he crawled to where the roofing boards converged with the walls in the corner and rose on his knees and released a stream of urine and watched it disappear into the straw. When he could no longer endure the heat in cramped quarters, he clambered down the staggered cliff of bales through strata of cooling air, his legs trembling for fear of making noise and from being broiled so long. As soon as he touched the floor, he sank into a bale. In the rafters above, like a great trapped beast, he could feel the heat he had escaped, waiting for him, and he sucked gulps of cool, habitable air into his lungs and let his blood cool and the sweat dry on his skin. But before a minute had passed, he grew convinced that he had betrayed his presence somehow, that Claude must be standing below looking at the ceiling and listening. Just until sunset, he told himself. He drew a slick forearm across his face and climbed back into the furnace. In the afternoon, the vestibule door opened and Claude walked into the open space at the front of the mow. "Edgar," he said softly. Then after a long pause, "Edgar." Edgar pressed himself into the hollow in the bales and held his breath. When the pounding in his head was too much to bear, he allowed himself an exhalation so measured he thought he might suffocate. There were footsteps on straw. A tremor shook the stack of bales. Something heavy thumped the floor. The bales shook again, and there was another thump. For one protracted moment, Edgar was sure Claude had begun tearing down the monolith of straw to get at him. The shaking and thumping continued in a steady rhythm, though there was barely enough room between the bales and the rafters. Edgar wormed his way forward. Claude was working by the long western wall, his head 5 or 6 feet below Edgar's. He wore a pair of canvas work gloves and was dragging out bale after bale and letting them tumble to the floor. It wasn't easy. The bales were stacked one pair lengthwise over another crosswise so that no column could shear away. He had already opened a semicircle cavity deeper at the bottom than at the top, and his shirt was dark with sweat halfway down his back. Edgar could hear him gasping in the heat. When 30 or 40 bales lay on the floor, he stopped and pulled the gloves off his hands and picked up a hammer from the floor and knelt in the cavity he had created, half concealed from Edgar. There was the screech of a nail pulled from the dry wood and a board clattering. Claude leaned back and rubbed his hands together as if reconsidering, then fetched his work gloves and put them on and shot his fingers together to seat them. The thought crossed Edgar's mind to pitch a bale down. 40 or 50 pounds of densely packed straw dropped from that height could knock Claude flat. But what would that accomplish? He wouldn't stay down. Besides, Claude was already glancing uneasily toward the vestibule door. In such cramped quarters, long before Edgar could wrestle a bale to the edge and tip it over, Claude would hear and look up. Then Claude was backing away from the bales. He set something small and glinting on the floor. A bottle, an old-time bottle with a crude blob of glass for a stopper and a ribbon around the neck with black markings. Claude stood looking at it, as mesmerized as Edgar. Then he moved the bottle against the mow wall with a gloved hand and thrashed up a pile of loose straw to cover it. He began to restack the bales. Edgar retreated. Shortly, there were footsteps on the mow floor, the click of the vestibule door latch, and more footsteps on the stairs. Edgar waited for the sound of Claude's boots on the driveway, but all he heard was his mother's voice as she encouraged the pups in the yard. He elbowed forward. Claude hadn't bothered to wrestle the topmost bales into place. Near the floor, the stacks bulged from the otherwise neat stair step of yellow, where Claude had momentarily covered the bottle in straw. Edgar now saw only a stretch of bare planking. He tipped the coffee can to his mouth, then climbed down, his body oily with sweat. He dragged away the bales Claude had moved. The wood plank was splintered where the nails had been pulled. He pressed the point of Henry's jackknife into the crack and pried it up. He didn't know what he expected to find. The hole was dry and empty like the one he'd found the night before, though deeper. He could easily accommodate the bottle Claude had set aside, the bottle that had not been a figment of his imagination or of Ida Payne's. It existed. He had seen it in daylight, if only for a moment. He walked to the front wall and cracked open the mow door and pressed one eye to the gap, blinking against the midday brilliance. Fresh air poured across his face, hot from the August sun, but soothingly cool after what he'd endured in the rafters. The mow door was hinged on the side nearest the house, and he could see only downfield where grasshoppers leapt like firecrackers ignited under the rays of the sun. Then Claude's footsteps sounded on the gravel. The truck started, idled alongside the barn, and stopped again. Edgar's mother called the pups. She could not keep them out for long in the heat, he thought. He listened for a moment, then shut the mow door and walked to the top of the stairs. This chapter is called Trudy. When Trudy reached the shade of the barn, she turned and knelt and recalled the pups, then coaxed them down the long concrete aisle. They were too old to be sleeping in the whelping pens, but keeping 4-month-olds there during the heat of August wasn't all bad. Pups that age still had a hard time regulating their body temperature and didn't always have the sense to get out of the sun. The whelping rooms, sealed from the outside, were often the coolest part of the kennel. She was latching their pen door when she felt his arms around her. She let out a brief pip of a cry before a hand clamped over her mouth and another was thrust in front of her face, fingers spelling like lightning. "Quiet, only sign, okay?" She nodded. He let go and stepped back, and she turned to look at Edgar. He stood holding a finger to his lips. His cheekbones jutted from his face, and the line of his jaw swept so sharply toward his throat that he seemed to be made all of sinew and bone. His hair lay matted and browned across his forehead, and his ragged clothes reeked as though he'd spent days in the barn, but his eyes were startlingly almost preternaturally clear, looking steadily at her from a face lined by tracks of sweat cut through dirt. The sight of him raced ahead of her thoughts, condensing only afterward into distinct, nameable feelings, as if her mind were accommodating too slowly the flash of a bright light, overwhelming relief, knowing her son was safe, fury for his punishing long absence, bewilderment at his appearance, which spoke of a long, harrowing journey. Before she could distill any of those thoughts into words, he was looking past her, through the whelping room door and into the main kennel. "Where's Claude?" he signed. "He's changing the oil in the truck. Where have you been? Are you okay?" He reached over and pulled the door closed. "I wasn't going to come back. I almost didn't." "But why? I signaled for you the very next morning. I told you ran because you were upset after what happened to your father." "They were looking for me?" "Of course they were. You're a runaway, but it's all right now. I told them it was an accident." She paused and corrected herself. "It was an accident." "Did you find my note?" "What note?" "You were gone when I got here last night. I left a note on the table." "There was no note." "Claude found it then." She had to think for a minute about what that meant. "I need you to do something," he signed. "Just come to the house. Don't go away again. If you do this, I promise to stay, but I need one night out here alone. After dark, I need you to keep Claude in the house no matter what." "Why?" "Because he's hiding something there." "Claude?" "Yes." "What would he hide?" He stared at her as though trying to find something. "What? What is it?" "Have you seen him?" Claude? No. In the rain. Have you seen him? She blinked. She didn't know what Edgar was talking about. She shook her head, and all this time she had imagined him coming back and everything being okay, but instead Almondine was gone, and here was Edgar, and he was obviously not okay at all. He was starved and crazed. Just come to the house. I don't want him to know I was here. You said he already knows. Yes, but he doesn't know I was out here, not in the barn, okay? Okay, don't cry. Take a breath. Okay, you can't tell him. If you tell him, I'll go away again. I swear it. I'll never come back. You will never see me again. You know I'll do it. Yes, you'll make sure he stays in the house after dark. I could say I wanted a night away. We could go into town. No, keep him in the house. If I can't, you have to. Turn the porch light on if you can't. Turn it on if I should stay away. All right. When this is done, I'll come back for good, I promise. Okay. Then there was a slam of the truck door and Claude's footsteps along the kennel aisle. Edgar stepped into the nearest whelping pen and pressed up against the wall. The pups began to yip and leap. Everything good in there? Claude called. You bet, Trudy said, taking a breath and trying to sound breezy. Just teaching these wild things to sit for a brushing. Need a hand? Nope. I'll shout if I do. Okay, done with the truck in 20 minutes, he said. She heard Claude fetch something from the workshop and walk outside. Edgar slipped out of the whelping pen. I'll be back after dark, he signed. Remember, if the porch light is on, I'll stay away until tomorrow. He looked back at her. I know. I was by the birches last night. She said, Edgar, there's something I need to tell you, something bad. He looked back at her. I know. I was by the birches last night. I'm so sorry, Edgar. He shook his head and wiped his eyes roughly and pushed past her and looked down the barn aisle. I put Essay in with Pout and Finch. What? She's in the run with Pout and Finch. Claude must have found her this morning when he found them. No, he would have told me. He's hoping I'll leave again. Before she had a chance to ask Edgar anything else, he slipped past and trotted out the rear doors. Trudy followed and stood on the threshold and watched him cut across the field and disappear into the thicket without breaking his stride. When she came back in, she stopped at one of the runs and rapped on the wood frame of the door. Finch and Pout pushed through the passageway from outside, and a moment later, Essay joined them. The dogs had been watching Edgar leave as well. I think we can do one more chapter. It's back to Edgar. When he reached the creek, he peeled off his shirt and submerged it in the cool shallows and wiped the sweat and chaff from his skin. It was hot, very hot, and the air was sticky wet, and he stood waiting while the beads of water evaporated. Then he walked to the vast dying oak at the far corner of their land, hoping to find Forte there. The tree stood black and vacant of leaves on all but a few high limbs. The moment he settled himself against its gnarled roots, he understood why the place had once appealed to this stray. From where he sat, Edgar had a clear view down the trail both ways. Neither the creek nor the road was visible, but a person approaching from either direction would be. And the trunk of the oak was broad enough to hide behind, but he didn't think he'd have to worry about that. Claude would have no reason to look for him in that spot over any other. He had never been along when Edgar and his father walked the fence line, and he knew nothing of the tree's significance. Edgar lay back and watched the mosaic of sky pass through the naked branches. In his mind, the image of Dr. Papineau kept appearing, the old man twisted and dying at the bottom of the Moe stairs. After all that had happened, it seemed far too much to wish that Dr. Papineau hadn't died. But Edgar thought how he would like to talk to Glen Papineau. He felt he couldn't stay unless he did that, but neither could he think of how to put his feelings into words. Regret was too simple. Woe, perhaps, was the closest thing, but it was a woe mingled with anger, and he didn't know what the word for that would be. And that wasn't right yet, anyway. He thought, too, about what he'd said to his mother, what he hadn't said as well. She had to believe he would run again if she didn't help, so he'd withdrew what he knew she'd wanted most to hear, that he'd been glad to see her, that touching her had nearly overwhelmed him. His memory of her had grown abstract while he'd been gone. The details of her face, the way she smelled, the vast charismatic aura of her. He desperately wanted to tell her what he'd learned from living, working, running with the dogs day and night, about Henry Lamb and Tinder and Baboo, and about the sunflowers, the fireworks, about the old man who had spoken from the back of Henry's shed. The temptation to return to the house with her had been so powerful, he'd finally had to run before his resolve collapsed under the weight of his loneliness. And loneliness was a big part of it. His proximity to the house and the knowledge that Almudine was gone had swept a desolation through him like he'd never known. He thought of the letters between Brooks and his grandfather, all those debates about the dogs and what they might become, how Brooks had said it would be better to imagine how men might become more suitable for dogs and not the other way around. After the last night, nearly sleepless in the heat, neither the afternoon sun nor the chatter of the squirrels could keep him awake long. He was thinking about Brooks and the dogs when exhaustion and sorrow combined to press him into unconsciousness. The August sun beat down, the cicadas paused their automaton scream, and when a cloud passed over the sun, presently the sky cleared, and they took it up again. When he woke, he heard a loud rattle approaching in the underbrush along the creek, and before he had a chance to move, Essay burst into the clearing and ran up to him, panting and scenting him frenetically. Someone had collared her, and near the buckle, a span of the collar was crudely wound with gray duct tape. He sat Essay and removed the collar and peeled the tape away. There, folded in thirds, he found the photograph he had left on the kitchen table. Beside his note, the photograph of Claude holding Forte in his arms. Inside that, 3 $100 bills, a 20 and a 10, and a key to the Impala. Well, that kind of twists things up. Okay, this next chapter is really short, so I'm going to read it. It's Glen Papineau. It was late afternoon when Claude called the office, which made Glen uneasy. Not good to be having such conversations at work, but he didn't have time to object. Claude's tone was so obviously rushed that Glen understood their conversation wouldn't last only a few seconds. What happened last night? Nothing. There weren't any cars parked around your place. The yard was empty. I walked your fence line a ways, but there wasn't any point. He hasn't shown up here. I bet he's in the barn, Claude. Didn't you say he'd been sleeping up in the mow before he ran off? Maybe he was there last night, but not now. It's hot as hell up there during the day. Think he'll come back? Yeah. To the barn or the house? I don't know. I have a hunch he's planning to take the Impala and run. I just discovered the spare key missing. Glen thought about that for a second. That would make things easy. He could pursue with the squad car. Say he recognized the vehicle, but not the driver. Okay, I'll come out tonight. Wait until dark. I'll make sure we stay in the house. I might even try to get Trudy away up to Ashland. Anyway, if you see a light in the barn, it's Edgar. What if he comes to the house? Then I'll put the porch light on. If you see the porch light, forget it. We'll work something else out. Porch light on means he's in the house? Yeah, and if you think he's in the barn, come up from the south field. Use the doors on that end. The dogs are less likely to see you. And that had been the end of the conversation. When 5 o'clock rolled around, Glen went back to his house. The day had been blistering and the evening hadn't cooled much. A guy Glen's size had a job staying cool. He sat in his kitchen, drank a beer and then another, and he looked at the whiskey flask standing in the middle of his kitchen table. He'd dumped the ether from the night before onto the lawn when he'd gotten home. The stuff was highly flammable, and you didn't leave it standing around, particularly in poorly sealed vessel. The spot where he'd dumped it was already marked in a kidney-shaped brown patch. When it was almost sunset, he drove the cruiser to the shop. He took a tin of ether, just like the night before, but this time he didn't bother opening it. He just set it on the car seat and drove out to the town line road. He parked his car in the weeds on the far side of the hill, saw the Sawtelle place, and then he pocketed the rag and the flask and took the rest of his equipment, a church key and a six-pack with the tin of ether wedged in, and walked up the road. A natural embankment rose on the side opposite the Sawtelle property at the very crest of the hill. Glen scrambled heavily up the rocks and settled himself where he had a view of the house and the huge old barn. The scene before him was awfully pretty. He could see down into the yard and along the hills rolling to the west. Whoever decided to build a farmhouse there had made a smart decision, he thought, nestling it down in a valley like that, protected from the wind yet flanked by open field on two sides. Both the truck and the Impala were parked in the yard. The porch light was dark, meaning Edgar hadn't gone into the house. Felt like a stakeout, Glen thought, sitting there. He'd never been on one of those. Not much need for it around Mellon. The idea tickled him. He cracked a Laney's as the twilight drained down the western horizon and stars began to volunteer in the evening sky. For a long time he watched the field and saw nothing but creation. He rehearsed in his mind how he would put his question to Edgar, how he wanted to emphasize that he was asking as Pop's only child, not as an officer of the law. Behind him, enough of the moon had risen that he could see the leaves shiver on the long, thin stretch of maples that jutted into the field, a slim finger of woodland pointing to where they'd buried Gar, an island of birches in the middle of that shimmering lake of hay. He thought about what would happen. Once Edgar was groggy, he would carry the boy to his car. Couldn't weigh more than 120. Glen could sprint across the field carrying that much, and when Edgar came awake again, they'd be traveling down some back road. Faintly, he saw the gray silhouette of a figure wading through the hay. Halfway between the road and the woods farther back, a dog accompanied the figure. They paused at the birches. Glen grabbed the tin of ether and scrambled down the embankment and crossed the road, keeping his gaze fixed on the two of them. There wasn't really any doubt about who it was, but he had to be careful now. He waited to see whether a light would go on in the barn, or whether the impala might suddenly roar to life. The figure disappeared into the darkness behind the barn. There came a brief volley of barks, then silence. It wasn't until Glen reached around to get the whiskey flask out of his back pocket that he'd remembered he had laid it aside at the top of the embankment. The ether tin was too squat to fit in his pocket. He looked at the beer bottle in his hand. He drained it in a gulp and punctured the little mushroom cap on the ether and tipped the vessels together. Vapor curled down the inside of the bottle, spilling over his fingers in silvery waves before dissipating into the night air. When he was done, he stuffed a corner of the rag into the bottle and waved the arrangement under his nostrils. His nostrils didn't even tingle. And if a little ether leaked, he wasn't worried. It took a lot of anything to affect Ox Papineau. Every once in a great while, his size worked in his favor. He tucked the beer bottle into his back pocket and checked his watch, and if that porch light didn't come on in the next 5 minutes, Glen told himself Edgar Sawtelle was going for a ride. We're going to stop there, friends. Tune in. Let me just see how long this next one is. I think we'll finish it on the next one. Join me. Make sure you subscribe. Leave a comment.